the winter of 1933, the Soviet government issued posters across Ukraine. They didn't advertise collective farming. They didn't celebrate Stalin's 5-year plan. They warned parents not to eat their children. Eating dead children is barbarism, the posters read. They had to make the posters because it was happening, thousands of times, across thousands of villages, mothers boiling the bodies of their own babies because there was nothing else left. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't drought or crop failure. This was murder by starvation. And it was deliberate. By 1932, Joseph Stalin had been consolidating power in the Soviet Union for nearly a decade. He'd eliminated rivals, crushed dissent, built a cult of personality that made him untouchable. But there was a problem. Ukraine. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, fertile black soil, endless wheat fields, a population of small farmers who'd worked their land for generations. They were productive, self-sufficient. And worst of all, from Stalin's perspective, they had a strong sense of national identity. Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian independence movements that had nearly succeeded after the Russian Revolution. Stalin saw all of this as a threat. Ukraine could feed itself. That meant Ukraine didn't need Moscow. And if Ukraine didn't need Moscow, other republics might start getting ideas. Stalin's solution was collectivization. Private farms would be abolished. All land, livestock, and equipment would become state property. Farmers would work on massive collective farms, kolkhozes, where the government controlled everything. Production, distribution, who ate and who didn't. The policy was announced in 1929. By 1930, armed brigades were moving through the countryside, forcing compliance. Farmers who resisted were labeled kulaks, a term that originally meant wealthy peasant but quickly became an excuse to punish anyone who objected. Kulaks were shot, sent to labor camps, or deported to Siberia. Entire families disappeared overnight. The collective farms were disasters. Farmers had no incentive to work hard when the state took everything. Equipment broke down, livestock died, production plummeted. But Stalin didn't care about efficiency. He cared about control. And then came the quotas. In 1932, Stalin imposed grain procurement quotas on Ukraine that were impossible to meet. The previous year's harvest had been poor. Everyone knew there wasn't enough grain to satisfy Moscow's demands and still feed the population. Stalin knew it too. He gave the orders anyway. Every collective farm had to deliver a specific amount of grain to the state. No exceptions, no negotiations. If a farm couldn't meet its quota, brigades would confiscate everything. Seed grain meant for next year's planting, personal food stores, livestock, anything edible. This wasn't taxation. This was confiscation. This was weaponized hunger. And it was about to get worse. The confiscation brigades arrived in autumn 1932. They came with soldiers. They came with quotas. They came knowing that taking the grain meant people would starve. They took it anyway. Armed men moved through villages, going house to house. They had long metal rods they drove into the ground. Searching for buried grain, they tapped walls listening for hollow spaces. They tore up floorboards. They emptied barns. They slaughtered livestock and loaded the meat onto trucks. If a family hid a bag of wheat, they were accused of theft, stealing from the state. The punishment was execution or deportation. So people stopped hiding food. There was no point. The brigades found everything eventually. By November 1932, the villages were empty of food. Every kernel of grain gone, every potato dug up, every chicken killed or confiscated. The collective farms had nothing left to distribute to workers. The state had taken it all. And then Stalin made it impossible to escape. In January 1933, the Soviet government issued a secret directive. Ukraine's borders were sealed. Internal passports were required for travel. Ukrainians were forbidden from leaving their villages. Train stations were patrolled by NKVD, secret police. Anyone caught trying to flee was arrested and sent back. The government wanted the Ukrainians contained. They wanted the dying to happen in silence, behind closed doors, where the world couldn't see. Certain villages were placed on blacklists. These were communities that had failed to meet their quotas, or where resistance had been reported. Blacklisted villages were cut off completely. No food deliveries, no trade. Armed guards blockaded the roads. Residents couldn't leave. No one could enter. The villages were left to starve in isolation. People ate anything: tree bark, grass, leather boots boiled into soup. They made flour from acorns. They ground animal bones into powder. They caught rats, birds, insects. They ate things that weren't food until those things ran out too. By early 1933, the real dying began. But the Soviet government wasn't finished. They passed laws making it illegal to collect leftover grain from fields after harvest. Previously, poor families could glean, pick up grain missed by harvesters. It wasn't much, but it helped. Now, anyone caught picking up grain was arrested for theft, children included. The state was criminalizing survival itself. Starvation is not a quick death. It's a slow dismantling of the body, a biological collapse that happens in stages. First, the body burns through its fat reserves. People become thin, gaunt, their cheeks hollow out. Their eyes sink into their skulls. They feel tired all the time. Then the body starts consuming muscle tissue. People lose the strength to walk, to stand, to lift their arms. A trip to the well for water becomes impossible. Children can't get out of bed. The body's organs begin to fail. The immune system shuts down. Minor infections become fatal. Diseases that a healthy person would fight off, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, kill within days. The mind deteriorates, confusion sets in, memory fails, hallucinations. Some people became violent, desperate. Others simply lay down and stopped moving. Starvation distorts the body. Stomachs swell with fluid. Kwashiorkor, it's called. People look pregnant even as they waste away. Skin becomes paper thin, bruising at the slightest touch. Wounds don't heal. Teeth fall out. Hair falls out in clumps. And then the body dies. But it takes weeks, sometimes months. In the winter of 1932-1933, this was happening to millions of people simultaneously. A teacher in the Kharkiv region described her classroom in early 1933, 30 students at the beginning of the school year. By February, 12 were dead. The rest were too weak to attend. She tried to hold classes anyway, but children would collapse at their desks. One girl fell over during a lesson. She didn't get back up. The teacher carried her body home. The girl's mother was already dead. Her father didn't have the strength to bury either of them. The bodies piled up. At first, people tried to bury their dead properly. Funerals, graves. But as the dying accelerated, that became impossible. Families didn't have the strength to dig graves. The ground was frozen solid. Bodies were left in homes, in barns, on streets. The NKVD organized collection crews, usually prisoners or workers from non-Ukrainian regions, to gather corpses and dump them in mass graves. Entire villages fell silent. No voices, no movement, just rows of empty houses with bodies inside. A survivor named Miran Dolo described walking through his village in March 1933. He saw a woman sitting against a fence, motionless. Her 2 children lay beside her, also still. He thought they might be resting. When he approached, he realized all 3 were dead. They had been sitting there for days. No one had the strength to move them. Another survivor, Maria Welichko, remembered finding her neighbor dead in her home. The woman had been alone, no family. She'd died sitting at her table, her head resting on her arms as if she'd just fallen asleep. Maria said the woman's face looked peaceful. It was the only peaceful thing she saw that winter. In the cities, things were marginally better. Factory workers received small rations. Communist Party members had access to special stores with food. But even in the cities, children begged in the streets, orphanages overflowed, train stations filled with refugees who'd somehow evaded the travel ban, too weak to go further. Many died on the platforms. The roads became corridors of death. People who attempted to flee on foot collapsed along the way. Their bodies lined the routes out of Ukraine. Some were buried by travelers who still had strength. Most were left where they fell. By spring 1933, the Ukrainian countryside was a graveyard. There is a limit to what the human body can endure before the mind breaks. The Holodomor found that limit. Cannibalism during the Holodomor wasn't an isolated horror. It was widespread, documented, reported in NKVD records that were kept secret for decades. The Soviet government knew it was happening because they had to respond to it, hence the posters. Eating your children is barbarism. People ate corpses. They dug up fresh graves. They killed those who were close to death. Some targeted children because children's bodies had more fat, more nutrition. Families turned on each other. One NKVD report from Kharkiv described a woman who killed her 2 children, cooked their bodies, and invited neighbors to share the meal. She was arrested, executed, but she wasn't an anomaly. The archives contain hundreds of similar cases. Another report detailed a man who murdered his wife and ate her over the course of a week. When authorities arrested him, they found her bones stacked neatly in a corner of their home. He told the officers he'd loved her. He'd had no choice. The word choice loses meaning in these circumstances. These were not moral decisions made by people in control of their faculties. These were humans reduced to biological survival instinct, their humanity stripped away by a government that had engineered their suffering. Mothers watched their children die and were helpless to prevent it. Imagine that. Your child is starving, crying, begging for food. You have nothing, no money, no grain, no neighbors with anything to spare because they're all starving too. You watch your child's body waste away. Their face becomes skeletal. Their stomach swells. They stop crying because they don't have the energy. They just lie there, staring at you, and then they die. Some mothers fed their older children the bodies of their younger ones, not because they wanted to, because the alternative was watching all of them die. Some survivors carried that guilt for the rest of their lives. Others never spoke of it again. There are accounts of children eating their dead parents, of families drawing lots to decide who would be killed and eaten, of travelers murdered on roads by starving villagers who'd formed desperate feral bands. The NKVD arrested thousands for cannibalism. Most were executed, some were sent to labor camps. The government treated cannibalism as a crime, as if the people committing it had any other option. As if the state hadn't created the conditions that made it inevitable. In villages that were completely isolated, the blacklisted ones, entire populations disappeared. When Soviet authorities finally entered these villages in late 1933, they found ghost towns, empty houses, mass graves. Evidence of what had happened. They buried it, literally and figuratively. One investigator described entering a blacklisted village near Poltava in May 1933. The village had a population of 2,000 in 1932. He found fewer than 300 survivors. Most were children, kept alive by eating the dead. The investigator's report was classified. He was reassigned to Siberia shortly after submitting it. The Holodomor didn't just kill bodies. It murdered innocents. It destroyed families. It broke the social contract that holds communities together. In the aftermath, survivors didn't talk about what they had done. Entire villages agreed to never speak of it. The trauma was too deep, the shame too great. Even decades later, many survivors refused to discuss the Holodomor. The memories were unbearable. While millions starved, the Soviet Union denied anything was wrong. Stalin's regime was masterful at propaganda. And in the 1930s, much of the world wanted to believe the Soviet experiment was working. The USSR represented a new way of organizing society. Many Western intellectuals, journalists, and politicians were sympathetic. They wanted communism to succeed. The Soviet government exploited that sympathy ruthlessly. Foreign journalists were invited to the USSR on carefully managed tours. They were shown functioning collective farms, ones that had been stocked with food specifically for the visits. They met healthy, well-fed workers who'd been coached on what to say. They toured cities where bread lines were hidden and stores were temporarily filled with goods. The most infamous example was Walter Duranty, the New York Times Moscow correspondent. Duranty had access to Stalin. He wrote glowing reports about Soviet progress. In 1933, while millions of Ukrainians were dying, Durante wrote that there was no famine. He admitted there were food shortages, but called reports of mass starvation anti-Soviet propaganda. Durante won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting from the USSR. He kept the prize even after his lies were exposed. Other journalists tried to tell the truth. Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist, traveled to Ukraine in March 1933 without government permission. He walked through villages. He saw the bodies. He spoke to survivors. When he returned to the West, he published articles describing what he'd witnessed. The Soviet government banned him from ever returning. Durante and other Soviet-friendly journalists attacked Jones, calling him a liar. Jones was later murdered in Mongolia under suspicious circumstances in 1935. Some historians believe the NKVD arranged his death. Malcolm Muggeridge, a British journalist, also reported on the famine. His articles were published but widely dismissed. The Soviet government denied everything, and much of the Western press sided with Moscow. Why? Because acknowledging the Holodomor meant acknowledging that the Soviet experiment had produced a humanitarian catastrophe. It meant confronting the possibility that communism, as practiced by Stalin, was murderous. Many people weren't ready to accept that. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, speaking about the famine was dangerous. The NKVD arrested anyone who discussed starvation openly. Letters describing the famine were intercepted. People who tried to inform relatives outside Ukraine disappeared. The government suppressed death records. Census data from 1933 was classified. When the 1937 census showed a massive population decline, Stalin had the demographers arrested and executed. The census was declared invalid. A new one was conducted in 1939 with falsified numbers. For decades, the Soviet Union maintained that the Holodomor never happened. Official histories didn't mention it. Textbooks skipped from 1932 to 1934 with no explanation. Survivors who spoke about it were punished. It wasn't until the 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to collapse, that Ukraine could openly discuss the Holodomor. Archives were unsealed. Mass graves were excavated. Survivors finally told their stories without fear of retribution. By then, most of the perpetrators were dead. Stalin died in 1953. The officials who'd carried out his orders either died in Stalin's purges or lived comfortably into old age. None faced justice for what they'd done. The death toll from the Holodomor is estimated between 4 and 7 million people. The exact number will never be known. Records were destroyed. Entire villages vanished. Many victims were never counted. 4 to 7 million dead in a single year, in one region, by government policy. Is it genocide? That question remains politically charged. Genocide, as defined by international law, requires intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The Holodomor targeted Ukrainians specifically. The famine was engineered. The borders were sealed. The kulaks who were shot and deported were disproportionately Ukrainian. Stalin's goal was to crush Ukrainian nationalism and resistance to collectivization. Many historians argue this meets the definition of genocide. Ukraine officially recognizes the Holodomor as genocide. So do dozens of other countries. But Russia disagrees. The Russian government acknowledges that a famine occurred, but claims it wasn't targeted at Ukrainians specifically. They argue the famine affected other regions, including parts of Russia and Kazakhstan. They say it was a tragedy caused by misguided policy, not deliberate extermination. This isn't academic hair-splitting. It's about responsibility. Calling the Holodomor a genocide means holding the Soviet government, and by extension, the Russian state as its successor, accountable for deliberate mass murder. For Ukraine, the Holodomor is central to national identity. It's a symbol of Ukrainian suffering under Russian domination. Memorials stand in cities across Ukraine. November, the month when the dying began, is a time of national remembrance. Survivors' testimonies are preserved. Children learn about the Holodomor in school. For decades, Russia tried to erase this history. Now, Ukraine is ensuring it can never be forgotten. The survivors who lived through the Holodomor carried scars for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from PTSD decades before that term existed. They had nightmares. They hoarded food. They couldn't throw anything away. Some couldn't bear to see children go hungry and would feed neighborhood kids even when they had little themselves. The trauma passed to the next generation. Children of survivors grew up with parents who were emotionally scarred, who flinched at the mention of famine, who never felt safe no matter how much food was in the house. And now the survivors are dying. The youngest people who remember the Holodomor are in their 90s. In another decade, there will be no living witnesses. The memory will be preserved only in documents, monuments, and the stories passed down. But the lessons remain urgent. The Holodomor proves that governments can weaponize food. That ideology can justify any atrocity. That the world will look away when acknowledging horror is inconvenient. That truth can be suppressed for decades if those in power want it suppressed. And it proves that even the worst crimes can be denied, minimized, or erased if enough people refuse to remember. In 1933, the Soviet government told the world that Ukraine was prosperous, that collectivization was working, that reports of famine were lies spread by enemies of the revolution. And for decades, much of the world believed them. The Holodomor wasn't hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because people chose not to see it. Journalists who had access wrote lies. Governments that knew what was happening said nothing. Intellectuals who admired Stalin dismissed the evidence. And 4 to 7 million people died while the world looked away. Power unchecked is dangerous, but power combined with ideology is lethal. Stalin believed he was building a perfect society. He believed the ends justified the means. He believed that Ukrainian resistance to his vision was a threat that had to be eliminated, so he starved them. The Holodomor is not ancient history. People alive today had grandparents who lived through it. The mass graves are still there. The documents exist. The evidence is overwhelming, but even now, some deny it happened. Some call it exaggeration. Some say the victims deserved it because they resisted collectivization. That's the final horror. Not just that it happened, but that people still defend it. When a government can starve millions of its own people, document the deaths in secret reports, and face no consequences. When the world can watch a genocide unfold and call it progress. When the truth can be buried for half a century. What does that say about us? The Holodomor is a warning about power, about belief, about the ease with which we justify atrocity when it serves an ideology we support. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with mustaches and goose-stepping armies. Sometimes it arrives with 5-year plans and grain quotas. Sometimes it wears the mask of progress. And sometimes the only people who tell the truth are the ones dying in silence, hoping someone, someday, will remember. Ukraine remembers. We should too.